Well, here we are again. Welcome back to the weekly OLA Adult Dad Faith Formation Gospel Podcast. This is the 19th Sunday of Ordinary Time, if you're keeping track. And this is podcast number 112, if you're keeping track. Who would have thunk it, right? So we are in the year of Luke, as we know. So this gospel reading will be coming from the Gospel of Luke. And we've got one of those Sundays where the church gives us two options, a longer version or a shorter version. And you know, here at the weekly OLA Adult Dad Faith Formation Gospel Podcast, we always choose the longer version so that if your particular parish has the longer version, you have that. And the longer version gives us a chance to learn that much more. So with that said, the longer version is Luke 12, verses 32 to 48. 16 verses long. The shorter version is Luke 12, 35 to 40. So we're talking 16 verses, verses 5. We're going to do the longer 16 verses option. It is a lot of verses. There is a lot packed in those lot of verses. So be prepared for about an hour-long podcast. Just kidding. Don't leave me yet. So Luke 12, verses 32 to 48. 19th Sunday of Ordinary Time. And in the longer version, we're going to see Jesus talking to his disciples, and that's important because everything Jesus says in this week's gospel passage, the audience are the disciples. It's not the people at large. He's talking to his disciples, so that we want to keep that in mind. And what he's going to be telling them, he's going to be starting out by giving them two examples, two stories, two short little parables, if you will, okay? And then he's going to be talking about a number of different types of servants. And as we go through the reading, if you read the longer version, see if you can spot where Jesus alludes to heaven, hell, and purgatory. Because believe it or not, in this longer version, Jesus is alluding to those three things, heaven, hell, purgatory, within the confines of this particular message that he's giving to his disciples. Okay? So keep that tucked away in the corner of your mind. Here we go. The first verse of our reading, verse 32, it says, Jesus said to his disciples. So that sets the audience a context. He's talking to his disciples, not to people at large. And then Jesus gives his disciples two stories, two examples, two parables. One about a master returning from a wedding. Another about a thief breaking into a house. Now, let's take a look at each of those separately, okay? He says, gird your loins. He's talking to his disciples now. He says, gird your loins, light your lamps, and be like servants who await their master's return from a wedding, ready to open immediately when he comes back. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds vigilant on his arrival. So the first little parable, the first little story he tells them is, you want to be like the servant who is awaiting his master's return and is ready when he returns. That's his first message in this overall message. Then he essentially hits the same point, but approaches it from a different angle, where he talks about a thief breaking into a house. Here's what he says to them, okay? He says, and he's talking about a thief, right? And then he's talking about that thief breaking into the house, all right? And he says, be like that servant who's vigilant. Because he says, if you knew when the thief was breaking in, you'd certainly be prepared for him, right? But even though you don't know when the thief is breaking in, you still want to be prepared. So both of those really hammer home the point of, and the overall point of the message, which you'll get to the end, since you don't know when the Son of Man is coming, Son of Man being himself, since you don't know when I'm coming, this is Jesus, since you don't know when I'm coming, okay, since you don't know when the last day will be, when the second coming will be, when the end of time will be, when the general judgment will be. In fact, when you don't know when your own particular judgment will be when you die, since you don't know that, all right, Jesus is saying, look, you've got to be ready. You've got to be like that servant that's ready to open the door when his master comes back. And you've got to be like that person in the house that is vigilant. So he's guarding his house, so when the thief breaks in, he can guard against it, all right? Because if you think about it, the message in both of these stories, if you reduce them down to one line, that one line would be what we would recite in the responsorial psalm for this Sunday. Stay awake and be ready, for you do not know what day your Lord will come. That's the refrain from the responsorial psalm we say before we hear this gospel. Stay awake and be ready. And Jesus is telling his disciples, what does that look like? It looks like the servant who's ready to open the door when his master returns, no matter when that might be. And it's like the guy who has his house secure, so when the thief comes to break in, he's ready for him, okay? Stay awake and be ready, for you don't know the day your Lord will come. That's the overall theme of this gospel passage, and that's the point Jesus is hitting home as we start this particular gospel reading when he's telling his disciples those two things, all right? Then he goes on, right? And then he goes on, and Peter, once again, steps forward, if you will, and speaks on behalf of him and the rest of his disciples. And he says, Lord, is this parable, and he's talking about the servant with the master returning and the person with the thief breaking in, is this parable meant for us or for everyone? Okay. Now, he's talking specifically to his disciples. But we know that everything Jesus said to any particular person back then, by extension, he's telling us in the here and now. So when Peter says, is this parable meant for us or for everyone? Yes and yes, right? It's meant for them at this particular time in history, and it's meant for all of us throughout history. And then Jesus, and this is the longest part of the long version, okay, starts talking about 4 different types of servants and 4 different states of readiness they're in and 4 different results of those 4 different states, right? Because again, Jesus is saying, be like the servant who's ready to open his door for his master. Be like the servant that has the house secure so he can guard against a thief. Jesus then says, we'll pick up the narrative, and the Lord replied. Peter said, is this meant for us or for everyone? And the Lord replied, who then is the faithful and prudent steward? Okay. To whom the master will put in charge of his servants to distribute the food allowance at the proper time. Now, here he's going to give 4 different stewards, 4 different servants that have 4 different responses and 4 different results. Here's the first servant. Blessed is that servant whom his master on arrival finds him doing so, finds him being awake, being vigilant, being prepared. Blessed is that servant whom his master finds vigilant, awake, and prepared. Truly I say to you, the master will put the servant in charge of all his property. Okay? Now, that's an example of a person who is vigilant, who is awake, who is prepared, who is in a state of sanctifying grace when the judgment comes, all right? Blessed is he because, he's ready for heaven. Servant number 2, all right? But if the servant says to himself, my master's delayed in coming, and he begins to beat the manservants and the maidservants, to eat and drink and get drunk, then that master's servant will come on an unexpected day and at an unknown hour, and will punish the servant severely and assign him a place with the unfaithful. So you've got the faithful servant, right, who's prepared, awake, vigilant, is in a state of grace on the day of his judgment. Blessed is he. Heaven, right? But the servant that says, something, I got plenty of time. I'm going to do my thing. I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry. I'm going to do what I want. And, because, Jesus, he's delayed in coming. He'll come back later. I'll have plenty of time to repent and ask for forgiveness later, right? If that servant, what's the result of his not being prepared, not being vigilant, not being awake, not being in a state of grace when he dies? He'll be punished severely and will be assigned a place with the unfaithful. Hell, in other words. Okay? Now you've got a third servant. Now that servant who knew his master's will, but did not make preparations nor act in accord with his will, shall be beaten severely. Okay? Now, that master who knew his master's will, but did not make preparations nor act in accord with his will, shall be beaten severely. So what he's talking about here is that servant that, on the one hand, wasn't totally prepared, vigilant, awake, all right? Wasn't in a state of grace when he died. Nor, on the other hand, was he like the other servant that was unprepared totally and was in a state of mortal sin when he died. So he wasn't those two servants, right? He's somewhere in the middle, okay? Where, he dies. He doesn't die in a state of mortal sin. He dies with some venial sins on his soul, okay? He's going to be beaten, right? But he's not going to be assigned a place with the unfaithful. So he's going to have to suffer some punishment. There's going to be some consequences, but it's not going to be the consequence of hell, all right? Now we're talking purgatory, right? And then the fourth servant, he says, and the servant who was ignorant of his master's will, but acted in a way deserving of a severe beating, shall be beaten only lightly. So here he's talking about the person who, in theological terms, has what's called invincible ignorance, right? Maybe the gospel hasn't been preached to him, right? He's ignorant of what the gospel says, not because he's keeping himself ignorant, but here's a case where the gospel hasn't been preached to him, okay? People where, around the world where the gospel hasn't been preached, where they don't know about the gospel, and they don't know necessarily about God's salvific plan, his redemptive plan, right? On the one hand, right, they can't go straight to heaven. On the other hand, they can't go straight to hell. They're beaten only slightly, okay? Again, they're going to have to spend some time in purgatory, but not as much time as that other one is. So Jesus is giving 4 different servants to illustrate 4 different responses to him and the gospel, okay? And the servant, that's response, he's prepared, he's vigilant, he's awake, he's done his master's will, he dies in a state of sanctifying grace. That's on one hand, okay? The servant that doesn't, that eats, drinks, and is married, that thinks he's got all the time in the world, that is living in a state of mortal sin and eventually dies in a state of mortal sin, that's on the other hand. Then you've got those 2 servants in the middle that, aren't, on the one hand, aren't totally prepared, totally awake, totally vigilant. They're not totally in a state of sanctifying grace, nor, however, did they completely reject Christ and the gospel, and nor are they in a state of mortal sin. They're kind of in the middle, okay? So they need some time in purgatory first before. So it's interesting to note that with this gospel message, the bottom line theme is, as the responsorial psalm says, stay awake, be ready, for you do not know what day the Lord will come. Jesus delivers that message first in the form of two short parables. The master that's ready to, or the servant that's ready to open the door when his master comes back, and the servant that has the house secure when the thief tries to break in. So he hammers home that point of staying awake, staying vigilant, staying ready, first by giving the disciples those two parables, and then a second time he hits on the same theme of readiness. Be awake, be ready, because you don't know when the last day is going to be. You don't know when you're going to die. You don't know when you're going to face your judgment. He gives that, he hammers home that point a second time by putting in front of his disciples four different servants who have four different responses, and the results of those four responses. And the results are, as we know, it's going to be either heaven or hell or sometime in purgatory before we get to heaven. So all of that we can kind of bring back and tuck into that responsorial psalm. Be vigilant, be awake, stay ready, stay prepared. You don't know when your last day will be. You don't know when your particular judgment will be. So act and live as if it's going to be immediately, because you don't know. So that's the long version. So Jesus really, if you look at his disciples, I mean, he is really hammering home this point, isn't he? By way of those two parables and those four servants. So because Jesus is hammering at this point in a lot of different ways, that tells them then and us now, this is really a point of emphasis for him. Look, you don't know when you're going to die, all right? And you have to be in a state of grace. And since you don't know, you've got to live as if it could be any time, and you've got to stay awake, stay vigilant, stay prepared, all right? Point of emphasis for Jesus to his disciples, and by extension, a point of emphasis by Jesus to us in the here and now. So that's the long version, Luke 12, verses 32 to 48. Hopefully I've done a fairly decent job of explaining it. A sobering message, to be sure, but a very instructive message if we take it to heart, which I hope we do. So with that, it's at the 17.5-minute mark. Not too bad for the long version of this gospel passage. So until the 20th Sunday of Ordinary Time, until episode 113 of these podcasts, as always, with Max behind the camera, me in front of the camera, us on the campus of St. Bonaventure High School, take care and God bless.